A large part of the modern warfare conversation centers on high-tech systems like hypersonic missiles, but smaller weapons like low-tech drones could be a serious threat to the U.S. military. Retired Air Force Lieutenant General Dave Deptula is Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. General, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks, Mimi. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here today.
So how do small, cheap drones uniquely threaten the U.S. military?
Well, Mimi, what I would tell you is that they can be effective in disturbing military operations, but frankly, they're not overly concerning, as we have and we're continuing to come up with means to deal with these threats. And there are really two elements to that. First is acquiring the appropriate level of situational awareness to then be able to implement countermeasures. I'd be happy just to give your audience a little bit of an overview of what both of those might entail, if you'd like.
I do want to hear that, but first, General McKenzie of Central Command has said that the U.S. has lost its advantage in the air because of these, he calls them Costco drones. He seems to think it's more serious.
Yeah, well, I would disagree with the commander. We haven't lost our advantage in the air at all. As a matter of fact, our number one asymmetric advantage in the United States military is our air power and what we can do with it. So while these are, like I mentioned earlier, elements that can disturb operations, they certainly don't stop our military operations, and in fact can be dealt with very effectively.
And what about these, small drones that are very cheap? They can be armed very cheaply, and then they can fly in under radar and, drop their munitions on soldiers.
Sure, but what size of munition are they dropping? Half a pound? In the grand scheme of military operations, we're talking about very, very small elements of explosive. And yeah, they can be, like I said, they can disrupt operations, but they're not going to stop operations. And we're talking about the very lowest end of conflict here. We're not talking about, these kinds of drones that McKenzie's talking about aren't ones that would have any impact whatsoever if, in fact, the Russians decide to invade Ukraine, or if the Chinese unwisely launched aggression against Taiwan or other nations in the area. So from the perspective of a major regional conflict, they're not that significant. And like I said earlier, look, we can deal with these things. So
yeah, go ahead and tell us about the capabilities for identifying, defending against them.
Sure. I mean, I talked about two critical elements. First is acquiring the appropriate degree of situational awareness. And in that context, what I'm talking about is we have means to detect, then we need to classify or identify just what kind of small drone we're dealing with. Then there's the issue of locating and tracking, and then alerting the forces. These are all important elements that contribute to our situational awareness. And once we gain this degree of situational awareness, we can then impose the appropriate countermeasures. In terms of countering these drones, there are really three primary ways to do that. The first one is by physically destroying the drone, or you can neutralize it, which is essentially just as effective. And then third, one could actually take over control of the drone itself. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, okay, that's great, but how do you go about doing that? Without getting into a lot of specifics, in general, we have means to use radio frequency jammers, global positioning satellite signal spoofers, high-powered microwaves, something as fundamental as nets and guns to shoot them down. High-powered lasers are becoming probably the solution of choice because they can operate at the speed of light and they can move and be integrated into the detection system to be able to react quickly. So that's the final piece. It's extraordinarily important, and that's the command and control enterprise to integrate all of these elements.
General, shifting topics a little bit, you wrote an op-ed about the U.S. drone program that's used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. You say that the capability is still really important. Why?
Well, it's extraordinarily important. I mean, let me just go to the area that we recently got out of, the Mideast. I mean, just because we're out of Afghanistan and combat operations in Iraq are over, that doesn't mean that our security interests in the region have sunset. We still need the ability to gather information which can empower allies or allow us to take appropriate action to include airstrikes. So just because U.S. boots on the ground are not in the region doesn't mean that we lack options. It's all about projecting smart power, not undue liability that plays into adversary strengths. And that's specifically what unmanned aerial vehicles allow us to do, to integrate that intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance with force application measures, and to be able to do it on the same platform in a matter of seconds.
All right, well, General, I appreciate you being on the program. We'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
All right, you have a great day.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.